All right. All right. I want to welcome everybody to today's edition of Noisy Reality. We're going to be talking with Professor Emeritus Eric Nellis, who is a Professor Emeritus of the University of New Brunswick in Canada.
I know,
And
British Columbia.
pardon me, British Columbia. And we're going to be talking to him about a book that he did called The Long Road to Change, which is a sort of longue durée, as they say, look at the American Revolution. And we're very happy to have him here. And thank you so much, Professor Nellis, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, I just want you to sort of lay out for us your take on what is the social structure in the colonies at the time of the onset of the revolution. What are the distinctions between the North, the middle colonies, the southern colonies, and how does that factor into understanding what the events are that we're trying to understand today?
Well, thank you. Well, briefly, the sections that exist in the United States today were created on the ground in the 17th century. And so what follows from that is the demarcation north and south, which was there not only at the time of the revolution, but was there 50 years or 75 years after. I'd say by 1700, you have sections. You have sections. And within sections, you have detailed sorts of examples of that. You know, the difference between Virginia and North Carolina, and between North and South Carolina. These localisms, in a way, at the colonial or provincial level, are there from the start. And I think that the geographical expansion of the United States had to accommodate that. But the politics that go with the social divisions, the two founding types, if you like, or three, I mean, it's a bit of a sort of but it's a convention to divide colonial America into North, Middle, and South. But within the North, Middle, and South, there are subdivisions, and those persist. They persist in shaping what was what became the problems of the sort of decade or two before the revolution, and a point I would make here is that as colonial America developed, and I did a dissertation on farms and economy and labor in Massachusetts, rural society, with a sideshow on Boston. But that sort of development, slow as it came, it's slow. It was slower than what was going on in Britain in the 17th and 18th century. And that's often overlooked. I mean, some of the older imperial scholars would note, James Truslow Adams and people like that, they would actually see that Americans were taken aback in the 1760s with the empire's redirection, and they shouldn't have been. They were living in a sort of precious little world of looking at themselves in these regions, which were quite distinctive. There's a wonderful example of a traveler leaving Pennsylvania in 1750, okay, and crossing into Virginia and wondering where the hell he was. That's how sectional colonial America was. Now, what inspired a sort of collective pulling together, if you like, between Congregationalist New England and Anglican plantation-oriented South Carolina, what pulled them together were politics. The politics that they developed locally that had nothing to do with each other in any sense. They were, the only thing they had in common was Great Britain as a protector and as a trade partner and as a provider of values, okay, political values. These colonial assemblies were shaped roughly, according to what was understood to be the British system. So when the British changed courses, especially after 1763, there's that wonderful notion of William Pitt, who won the 7 Years' War for Britain with deficit spending, by buying off the Prussians in Europe and the natives in America, and winning the war again. That's an enormous global event. The Treaty of Paris in 1763. Everything starts there in the shaping of the United States. And so what happened there was the British said, okay, the rest of the continent's open. And then King George and his parliament said, no, it's not. We don't want you. We don't want you. We don't want South Carolina backcountry people or Pennsylvanians in the backcountry, Western Pennsylvanians, or New England. We don't want you in that territory west of the Appalachians. We don't want you there. In fact, any of you that have been there, the old Ohio Company of the 1740s that George Washington, in fact, was connected with, they'd just sent people into that French territory, which helped start the French and Indian War. So those people, you're ordered back to where you came from. That is a moment where these disparate units in the empire, and one might include Jamaica in that, or Barbados, or by 1740s Nova Scotia, or even Newfoundland. They're all part of that empire, and they're seen collectively by the British as one sort of unit, one unit in the Western Atlantic. And in it, what had happened, and it's a wonderful, in my slavery book, one of the things that struck me doing that was something I'd known, and that is that the difference between West Indian slavery, French, Dutch, or British, was no residence, no white resident culture, no politics there. It's all, offshore. And so the big thing about American slavery in that sense is that it was allowed, in a sense, to develop without any restraint, first in Virginia and then, all the way south. And so that as new colonies come on, North Carolina, South Carolina, and then ultimately Georgia, which was not supposed to be a slave colony, as it came on, it brought slavery with it. Slavery into the United States was by imitation, by convenience, by imitation of Barbados, for example. Slave codes really just simply imitated Barbados. But that development was, what was it? Edmund Burke's phrase, salutary neglect. That's a very famous trope. James Henrietta did a book on it. And it was in that period between about the 1720s and 1760s, really, to the end of the 7 Years' War, where the Parliament really and the Crown, it simply left Americans to their own devices. Trade was good, it was harmonious, and so on and so forth. But there are other reasons why there was resistance that was sort of not localized. Trade. I mean, the economics of the American Revolution, I mean, it goes back to the progressives at the beginning of the century, the reformers there who saw they're attacking capitalism in 1900 or 1910. James Beard, was one of those. And Eric Foner's father, in fact, a little Philip Foner, all the ways later, those people, and Parrington and so on, all the way up to Hofstadter, they in a sense wanted to see economics as a mechanism in the American Revolution, the causal thing. Frankly, I apologize, for reducing this, but the British brought on the revolution. The notion that somehow or other, as Galloway and others suggested, Franklin himself, there's that famous, and it's in the book here, I think, when he was asked, in 1766, what are the feelings towards the empire? in the colonies, and Franklin was highly respected on either side of the Atlantic. Well, he said in 1763, they were harmonious, happy. We were all proud to be freeborn Englishmen and happy to be in the empire, in the nurturing, embrace of the empire. Not so good now,
Yeah,
3 years later.
right.
The feeling is not so good now.
Now, one point that's not really emphasized a lot in these more recent interpretations and discussions about the Revolutionary War is the impact of the Great Awakening. And that is that the Great Awakening, does it have an impact politically in the early part of the 18th century in terms of creating a feeling of disrespect to Anglicanism, to the High Church of England, etc.? And we know that that kind of fundamentalism was also impregnating the upper classes in England. Lord North was a fundamentalist. So I'm wondering,
Right.
and normally we don't talk about religion, but how do you see the first Great Awakening as a factor in the mental and psychological attitudes of the colonists and
Well,
also those in the metropole?
Well, the Great Awakening is, I once had an honors student at UBC who was looking for a topic, and he's an active Christian, and I said, take a look at the Great Awakening in America, the first Great Awakening, which he did, and it revived my interest in it from the perspective of a sort of populism that arose. I mean, the sermons, Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards's rabble rousing, and what you had were congregationalists like Jonathan Edwards who would take the tactic, pardon me, of arousing a population with fiery language, Old Testament stuff, and so I was fascinated by that about James Davenport, cuckoo. I mean, here's a guy, he's arrested every 10 minutes in New England for demonstrating in the streets. And it gave me a flavor when I read this stuff of just how loose the society had become through that. So the Great Awakening's impact on the American Revolution is, I think, the old one, and it's been said before, as though the old historians always used this, that it opened up the society a little bit. Mm-hmm. And that's saying too much because, frankly, the word class in America is, it's a funny word. There's a middle class and then there's nothing else, okay? Politicians, when they talk about what's wrong with the country? Well, the middle class needs a tax break, or the middle class this and that. There's no working class. There's no upper class. There's sort of language that would not have been understood in the 17th and 18th century. There were better sorts, okay, and lower sorts and bad sorts and this sorts. There were sorts, and there was deference. There was a hell of a lot of deference. Frankly, there was deference during the Revolution and after it. And so Americans would defer to someone not by birthright, but by some other measurement. And I think the Great Awakening, in a way, broke down, as you say, the Congregational Church, the Anglican Church. Everybody should read Woodmason's accounts of trying to a missionary, okay, in the in Carolina. In South Carolina backcountry, trying to convert people in 1750, 1760, just before the Revolution. He's trying to convert people away from Presbyterianism and the horrors of the Awakening. These people have been damaged by the Awakening. So the reaction to the Great Awakening is not political, it's religious. And I think the First Amendment of the United States really should be just understood for what it was. It was a given. It was a given. It applied to Christians, to be sure, but the idea of an established church anywhere in America is impossible because of the flux in the colonial period, not only of competing religious interests, but of the society itself. You know, New England is, and you know, I spent 2 years in Boston, and I spent hours in every archive in Massachusetts, I think, and the feeling I got from it was, here's a society I quite admire. You know, in the 17th and 18th century, I quite admire it. Never mind the Minutemen who come along and all that stuff, but just simply, if you were willing to, you know, accept Calvinism, accept the doctrines of Calvin, and the ministerial apparatus, it was a good place to be, and it was a good place to be for people. And the only way you can compare that in the regional sense is that the best poor man's country would be Pennsylvania, because of, you know, redemptionism and the way the land was distributed, unlike Massachusetts. But when you get to the South, you're dealing with you don't have a culture so much, but you have a sort of an odd form of aristocracy and a feudalism in a sense in the 17th and 18th century. Don't forget that, or I'm sorry, but slavery did not take root in Virginia until around 1700. You can't start with this, the 1607 project. Well, that's good, but that's symbolism. But you don't get slaves replacing white indentured servants until 1700. And then you get a racist kind of subculture that begins to form around the holdings. We're talking about plantations that are not really plantations by Brazilian or West Indian. These are small operations. You know, even Carter and Jefferson later on, with all their holdings, they never did have huge throngs of slaves on a property at any time. Their properties were separated and disparate, so they would control counties here and there. King Carter is a wonderful example of that, you know, in Georgia. And so the point about what I see as dominant at Great Awakening, for example, is that it shattered the Anglican Church in the South, for sure. But what did it replace it with? Baptists. And depending on your predilections, are Baptists better than Anglicans? And what the Anglican response was Methodism, Wesley, and right. I suppose you could say Whitefield. That what is that? It's kind of modified or abbreviated form of Anglicism. But whatever it is, those things really, I don't know. The Great Awakening into the Revolution is it's hard to show it. I mean, by converting, by rising Quakerism. Quakerism was on the decline in Pennsylvania. Presbyterianism, Scotch-Irish, they're elevating it. And what do they elevate? They elevate a sort of I think what's manifest there is evidence that the Great Awakening did not influence the American Revolution.
Interesting.
Not in any sort of direct way, but because I think what influences the American Revolution is politics, stamped into what is forced upon a bunch of disparate parts and cultures. It's forced on it, right, by British actions. That's a simplistic view, and it runs against a lot of common sense history. That how do you explain the Minutemen? How do you explain when the call goes out, the British Gage's army at Lexington and Concord is surrounded by thousands of farmers with guns? You know, how do you explain that if not a popular uprising?
Right. Right. Now let me get into, you alluded earlier to the situation in 1763, and you have England coming out of the 7 Years' War with a debt of 122 million pounds. They're paying annually 4.5 million in interest. They have a budget annually of 8 million pounds. So
Yeah,
hence they are spending over half their budget
they
covering
are.
that.
Yeah.
And then the amount that they're going to get from imposing the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act are only about 150,000 pounds.
But
So
doesn't pay for the administration of it.
exactly. And then, of course, they're confronted with a pan-Indian uprising,
Yeah.
which had been brewing since
Yeah.
1759, 1761, Pontiac's revolt. So what is, and then, of course, these ungrateful Americans are just saying, well, what are you imposing these taxes on us? Because, we don't need to pay them. I mean, what's your sense of all that? And what's the sense of the idea of the colonists having this idea that they're taking our liberty away from us?
Well, I mean, all of that, the language, liberty, slavery, they're making slaves of us. I mean,
Right,
if
slaves. Yes,
you look at the
exactly. Yeah.
literature, in the archives or in the recorded documents, the word slave shows up. That the king and parliament are enslaving us, by imposing these taxes against our will. Well, I think and we're talking not about the common sort of the shit kicker in Massachusetts or the corn husker in South Carolina. We're not talking about them. We're talking about the educated, literate elite, not elite, but that class of Americans who are subject to this. Who's going to pay for the Stamp Act? The stamps. Who pays for the stamps? It's people with money. The guy on the farm, it doesn't affect him until he's told it does, and until it reverberates to him. Like, you want a legal document? Well, they didn't deal in legal documents. This is a merchant kind of culture. My friend John Tyler, this book, Merchants in the American Revolution, made that very clear that those taxes were imposed, and James Beard had said it, that when I talk
Charles
about
Beard, Charles Beard,
politicization,
Charles Beard, Charles Beard.
yeah, yeah.
You're James Beard. You're talking about the
Well, okay, but I mean,
yeah, go on.
but
Charles Beard. Go on.
that wonderful word, Jim, politicization.
Yes.
I think what grabs me is maybe I've been politicized myself over 87 years. From this to that, I've been made aware of politics as a young person. I've gone to the left, the Labour Party in Scotland, the NDP in Canada, or the Liberal, that I've been politicized by circumstance and by a condition. I think that the big thing to look at is that thesis, that sort of model. Historians are not supposed to have models for anything, but there is a model of, and political scientists would definitely understand this, that societies shape themselves, and the politics that emerge come from shifting in the Western culture, at least, and in China today, from being politicized. How are you politicized? When I went to China. I lived in China for about 6 months on a Pacific Pacific scholarship exchange. And one of the things I noticed, this is 1992, right after Tiananmen Square. And the lingering sort of Maoism I saw shocked me. They were already building big hotels. The market economy was coming in and all the rest of it. But that culture there in 92 had to be politicized. It had to be shifted from its Maoism. It's deferential, it's oppression under the Mao system, to become the wide-eyed capitalists they've become. I saw that transition there, and it fed me in that politicization. How do you get politicized? The great thing about the United States, and I note in that book, there are two things that struck me reading it again recently. Was one, that the making of the Constitution is a remarkable bit of work. There's nothing original in it. They didn't invent the damn thing, all the language in it, but the shaping of everything they knew and understood, like the Declaration of Independence. What does it Jefferson say? If I'd put down what was in my mind, you wouldn't understand it. So I want you to understand this. It's Locke and it's Ferguson and it's it's Adam Smith. It's this. It's that. Oh, you're familiar with that, right? So I'll put it in the Declaration. along with the sort of sub-running titles, about that bastard, what he's done to us and all the rest of it. And Paine comes along with the same sort of message. He's not, Paine, Common Sense is a beautiful piece of work. And it actually, he understands colonial America as well as anyone. And he understands it in comparison to Great Britain. But he notes that these early stages, from actually running from the 7 Years' War, which introduced a lot of colonials to the empire directly. I mean, all the militias that took part in the 7 Years' War really didn't know what the empire was in many cases. What's the empire? Well, I don't know. I'm a freeborn Englishman living in this place. And so the introduction there is a process of politicization. So I think it's easy to see that, but I don't want to carry any of this too far, but the Constitution is a gorgeous piece of work, in my opinion. I would never taught the Revolution course or anything else without, Federalist 10. What a beautiful, and I mean, I know it's overdone. There are better pieces in the Federalist Papers in some respects. Hamilton, I think, is the most astute in so many ways, that book, but number 10, wow. And you think, reading it, I know this New York, and I mean, he's trying to sway the New York Convention, but he's referring to Hobbes. He's referring to an old sort of that any educated New Yorker would understand then, his points of reference. If you democracy, fail. I mean, why? You just looked at the Zenger trial in New York, where you get somebody taking over. A small.
Oh yeah, tell us about your take on the Zenger trial.
I think it's great.
Yeah,
I think to me, I don't think it gets enough attention, and I regret that the revolutionary leaders, in fact, don't refer to it so much. It did two things. It showed that you could, in fact, slander someone, or not slander. You could criticize someone of supposedly immunity, like a royal official or anybody else. You could actually talk down about them. You could talk them, and you could insult them. You could, which they did. Cosby's little regime went nuts with its appointments and all the rest of it. Madison, I would say that Madison doesn't mention it, but I read it in there. And the other thing that comes out of Zenger is the idea of an opposition. I mean, it was forming in the British culture. Opposition everywhere in Europe was simply pitchforks and tambourines. There was no sort of formal political or intellectual approach to organized opposition to any government or royalty or crown, or and so I think Zenger did that. It showed that in the trial, which is a wonderful trial. I mean, it really is, that you can have opposition. You can have an organized opposition that functions, and it's actually helpful. It's useful. And as it turned out, it's the aftermath of the Zenger trial, the Morrisites. I mean, Zenger gets arrested and jailed, but the Morrisites take charge in New York. And they, in fact, by being an opposition that finds a way to get rid, painlessly, really, of an oppressive democratic regime. Madison's point is that, and Americans go on, we're losing our democracy. Well, the United States is not a democracy, no more than China's a democracy. I mean, it's what it is a congeries of Republican representative governments that function as representative governments, and democracies don't work. Socrates knew that. They don't work. When I was doing my dissertation, for example, I was fascinated by I'd go to the Boston records, or the town records. They're wonderful, given the Puritan tendency to anal, behavior. I mean, record every bloody thing, and so I'd go there and I'd look at these meetings. They're recorded verbatim, volume after. I had it one time. I bought them in a used bookstore in Boston. The reports of the commissioners of the town of Boston. They'd gone through every handwritten bit of paper and published these 20 or 30 volumes there were, covering it up to when Boston became a city in 1830. From 1630 to 1830, 200 years of this recording. And I would look at these meetings, and I thought, that's as close as the United States has ever come to a democracy, in the pure sense of that.
Interesting.
For these town meetings,
interesting.
Everybody shows up, and everybody yells and screams and everything else. And it's the town that represents. See, again, looking at this regionalism and why, for example, the British were Gage, for example, warned, watch these people in New England. They may be this, they may be, maybe you don't like them, but they have a political system that informs them, that's politicized them into having assumed rights of representation. Never mind the language of the Stamp Act. It's that warning that I'm looking at these people, and they go to town meetings and they vote, and the town, and who sits in the Massachusetts legislature? The towns. So that when the coercive acts, the intolerable acts, when they're applied, the big thing is to take away the Massachusetts government, to just cancel it, to nullify it. Well, you're nullifying all the towns. It's not held by any group. It's the towns. So there's a form of, we call that democracy, but really what it is a kind of representative system that guarantees, I think, fairness and justice. So, and there's still deference there. I mean, from Samuel Sewall down to John Adams, there's deference and expected deference, but it's an odd. Adams once said, "I work as hard as any farmer, as a lawyer," and I take that as it's a Calvinistic, it's his way of justifying himself. But the way in which the system there is defined, I think, is very important in what I mean by politicization. And that when the British say impose, it's easy to get the Minutemen.
Right. Now, one thing I want to get into is that you talk about politicization. So you have, in reaction to the Stamp Act, you have the Virginia resolves that I believe were published in Rhode Island.
They were, yeah.
And that, of course, Rhode Island is sort of unique in the colonies because of its charter. It still retains sort of the freedom of religion charter from Roger Williams and all that. And then you have, in June, you have Massachusetts asking for a united statement against the Stamp Act, and you have the Sons of Liberty formed, which in some senses, you look at it, and in terms of mob behavior in America, which I've always loved reading George Rood and Hobsbawm on mobs. New York is filled with mobs of different types. But you have this North End and South End in Boston of basically your gangs that then form the Sons of Liberty. And then they're also involved in ritualistic parades, which are used to satirize power. So Pope's Day in November,
Pope's Day is a
all
big
the colonies becomes a day where they basically reject completely the Stamp Act and do it with great pizzazz. They burn, they threaten. I think don't they attack Hutchinson's house?
Yeah.
So tell us all about that, because you talk about politicization and this rootingness that they feel that these assemblies, and yes, we know the assemblies are limited to white males, women can't vote. There are slaves in all these populations. And the other thing that was interesting in the newer scholarship is the presence in these mob actions of slaves, of free
Yeah,
blacks.
that's right.
Crispus Attucks, of course, killed
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Boston
What's
in
later? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
1770 is a free
Yeah.
black. But there's a segregation also that occurs in these demonstrations against power in November of 1775, excuse me, 1776, 65. So just what's the sense of that? That this bottom up kind of rebellion that's occurring throughout
Well,
the colonies.
I think one of the best books ever written on the revolution is Gary Nash's
Right.
𝗔𝗺𝗲𝗃 Crucible. And I think that should never go out of date. It's 40 years old now. It's a wonderful book in which he doesn't say this is where it all starts, but without the urban community, without the mob, without the sense of what organization, um, the way that Hancock, for example, could just simply, here's a guy that you're talking about deference. And there's that great book, The Shoemaker and the Revolution, Alfred Young's book. Again, I recommend that.
On
Uh,
Ebenezer McIntosh.
yeah, there's Ebenezer Mac. Yeah, but Young's character, George 12 Trees Hughes, um, the interesting thing about that, just to shift your point a bit, is that when the Tea Party gets named Tea Party, it's not called a Tea Party till later, right? And then why is it called a Tea Party? Well, it's because we're fashioning a sort of retrospective nationalism here, or we're really inventing a national sort of credo. They take Hughes, he's an old man, he lives to be about 90, and they parade him on July the 4th all over the place, okay, as a survivor of the revolution, a guy who was at the Boston Tea Party, and he was a friend of Hancock. You see, he actually visited Hancock. And Young's wonderful reconstruction of this is good. But Young's point is that the middle class, if that's what we want, but that class, the political class, really exploited the ordinary man's part in the revolution. And that, to me, all the way to Jackson, well, it was in Jacksonian era when this happened. I think that's quite interesting, but it doesn't tell me much about politicization in the larger sense, which I think is something that has to be both promoted and then experienced. So when I think America becomes more and I don't know what the word is here, but when it becomes a little more sort of fairness, it's not egalitarian, but a sense of egalitarianism, I think, emerges from that. And it's with land, and it goes with land. So the oppressed New Englander or New Yorker who's running out of land, possible inheritance or anything else, the possibility of him getting land, oh, suddenly there's Ohio, with the Northwest ordinances. That sort of taking an experience of not deference necessarily, but certainly not open. The ambition then of the Ohio farmer becomes very, very, I think, political.
Yeah.
I think that's a form of politicization. And these people, wherever they're from, but again, I may stretch that politicization issue too far, but I think what the British do in the 1760s, and we focus on the Stamp Act and so on, and I think we should. Edmund Morgan's book, on the Stamp Act crisis.
Right.
Out of it came, the wonderful phrase, no taxation without representation. When that, I think, does filter down. So I think people at every level, except the vast majority of slaves, and maybe even there are still indentured servants in some parts of the South. I'm not sure it affects them, but it affects people in the North, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in New England, that they have, in fact, rights defined in this way. So again, it's finding evidence of that. That's why I like the Hughes business of being paraded as a symbol. It backfires a bit in that I think we don't get. I mean, when we talk about Jacksonian democracy, I don't know what the hell that means. What it means is that these states, like Ohio, for example, and others, have what they've drunk the water of individualism and liberty. I mean, Lincoln comes out of a hard-scrabble world into what a more open system where he's a little freer than he was, or his family. I mean, the family was. And what's that wonderful trope? Lincoln was born in a log cabin that he built himself.
Right.
I mean, that's a political sort of message somewhere along the line,
Right.
And
Right.
anyway, I off the
All
topic
right.
there.
No. It's fine. Now you have then this, you have Pitt come back in, and Pitt the elder is sort of, along with Edmund Burke, is sort of amenable. He's against. It's actually a minority when you look at the Parliament. It's a minority of opinion that's fighting against these ideas. That George III, I can see, is a very strong participant in all this because he is in favor of stamping the authority of the king on the colonies. And then you have the Townshend duties in 1767, and responses to that with Dickinson's famous essay of Notes to a Farmer, Samuel Adams.
Yeah.
And then I get a big kick out of Lord Hillsborough because I didn't realize in 1768 that they used to paint on people's. They called it Hillsborough paint, which was a
Hillsborough
mixture
paint,
of urine and feces, which the mobs would use to sort of demonstrate. And here's where Hillsborough's urging Gage to use troops and the landing of regiments in Boston. So what is it? How do you see all that starting to happen?
Well, I mean, there's again, it goes back to Parliament, and they're sitting in Parliament, and what they're saying is these ungrateful bastards, Stamp Act. Wow, it's unconstitutional. It's treasonable, really. Some of the language that comes out of it. But then the Townshend Acts are sort of, it's appeasement. Oh, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go back to the old system. We'll tax you for things that come on shore and all this stuff, which ultimately leads, of course, to the stupid tea issue. The British never learn. They don't learn. They don't take that language seriously. How it filters down, though, is a good point. I mean, where does that, smearing shit, the Hillsborough crap? I mean, the occupation in Boston, for example, of imperial troops, of British troops in 1768 was offensive to the letter. I mean, they're off the castle in the harbor. They hide there. Eventually, they're harassed. They're harassed, right down to the Tea Party. The origins of the Tea Party are part of that same, we'll get the Quartering Act, we'll get another Quartering Act. And those things bear, they weigh. But whether or not, and I think what we're getting at here is, can we see the revolution from the bottom up? Take a Howard Zinn approach and just see everything from that perspective. And I'd be happy if that was the case. And I don't know where it would take the revolution. It seems to me that the revolution is really, as Hannah Arendt said, and Edmund Burke said, it's a pure revolution, a political revolution. It's organic. It comes out of the people, but it doesn't come out of the mob. It doesn't come out of, Hamilton is right. I mean, his experience looking back at popular unrest,
right?
And Gary Nash made some of this too in his book. But when he looks back at it, he thinks, what part did the mob play? Hamilton, the great speech I threw in that book, I couldn't resist it. I say leave government and rulership to the few. They will always keep the many in check. And they, the few, because they've got nothing to gain from it, will forever be good rulers. I don't know where that theory comes from, but that's Alexander Hamilton, bless his heart. I
Well,
mean, the musical notwithstanding, this man, I have to say, I got very fond of Hamilton. Can I interject a personal note
please,
here?
please.
Well, I was doing a class on the Revolution, and for an hour, I spoke about Alexander Hamilton, how important he was. And my habit, well, you see, I have no notes. I would lecture without notes. I'd cue myself on the blackboard and carry on. And I went on about Hamilton, 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 all the way to Burke, to his death. And then I went on about how his notion of growth over time became the more sustainable American credo in terms of economic development rather than growth over space. Okay, that sort of theory. And I was going on about that. And I talked about Hamilton's personality as best I could. I mean, the biographies are just by, they're mostly, they swing from criticism to hagiography. But in any case, I was walking, it was a night course, and I was walking these students back. I'd signed up to walk, as a sort of security in a darkened campus at UBC, Vancouver. So I was walking these two girls, really good students, and one of them said, my God, that was something. You went on for 45 minutes there about Alexander Hamilton. How the hell how do you know all that? And I said very casually, oh, I just made it up.
Yeah.
The chair of the department called me the next day. This student said you're making up your lectures. So we had a big talk about that. But
Right.
again, a lot of it is made up. A lot of it is made up. I mean, you go from the hagiography of Parson Weems, Mason Weems, to what we get nowadays, finding fault with Washington.
Right.
What the hell is that? I mean, what's wrong with George Washington? Oh, he was a dull son of a bitch. I mean, what? Who are these people? But
Right.
back to the point about the populace. The population. Its part, as Howard Zinn said, turn the whole thing on its head and just look at it from this perspective. And I like that approach. I mean, it's radical, and for me, I liked it. I love it. It suits my predilections, but it ignores what the revolution really was. It was guided, shaped, and so on. And I read it not so much at the Declaration of Independence, but in the Constitution. I read it there, and I read it in the Federalist Papers. That that's the design, if you like, of the United States takes place. But it's based on what I saw in colonial America.
Yeah. What's
Regions.
what's interesting when you talk about the bottom-up approach is I remember when I first read Jack Tar in the Streets by Jesse Lemich, and I had the same reaction because while I do believe that one has to have a sense of the bottom-up approach and all that, one cannot ignore, which unfortunately you'll see sometimes in current writing, the elites operating, and they tend to dismiss that, which I think is a big mistake. Now, you have also Parliament is responding all the time to this. In 1770, they repealed most of the Townshend Acts, and then you have the Boston Massacre in 1770. So how do you read that incident happening? And what also I find fascinating about all this is through this, because if we build up to the Boston Tea Party, of course that term wasn't used until the 19th century, the Tea Party.
Yeah.
This is well organized. This is a well organized protest. When you look at how they actually go and implement throwing that tea over, and what also fascinates me about that, it occurs in the midst of this international economic crisis affecting the
Right.
East India Company. And then
But the
when you
East
look
India Company were driving the British economy, and then stopped. It ceased to. Yeah.
right. And they want to sort of use the United States to dump all this tea to sort of help them out. But at the same time, the king, and here's where you go to, so these are kind of things Americans don't normally think about. this is at a time when George III is thinking about war in Poland, because this is the time when Poland is gobbled up and they're worried
Right.
about having to intervene in the Baltic to fight
Yeah.
against the Russians. So just explain that whole tapestry that surrounds the event of the Boston Massacre.
Well, I take it from the ground up. What you have is a quartering act, and you
Tell the
have
people, tell us what that is. What's the Quartering Act?
the quartering act is Parliament's what authority imposed on the colonies everywhere, mostly in the port cities, to allow for the quartering of British troops in their midst. And this had evolved through the through the Stamp Act crisis beyond. So by the early 70s, they were into the third or fourth quartering act. They would renew it and renew it. So the quartering act put a lot of British troops, regulars, experienced veterans in Boston and New York, especially. And most of these guys, they're unemployed. They're sitting around all day with nothing to do. So they take jobs. A lot of them worked. Boston had rope works, okay? They were massive. There was one industrial enterprise that Boston mastered, was the rope works, and where they make ropes for sail ships. And the British troops occasionally a private, even up to sergeant, they would find a job there and get paid. And that was going on all the time. And what there was a sort of gradual conflict between port workers and ordinary workers, mostly unskilled in Boston, and the imposition of British military getting jobs. Now, I don't know the details. I mean, I know I could find out, I could go to the Boston records and find out why it was that British soldiers were given jobs in the rope works that, aggravated the situation of their presence by, were they denying jobs to locals? I don't think so. Or were they? And if so, what kind of a system is that? Well, they would fight. And this is where Sam Adams becomes everybody's favorite. This guy's a tavern brawler. I mean, he's the real deal when it comes to street politics. And he knows what he's doing better than anyone. And he's agitating. I mean, don't forget, it's his pamphlet, The Horrid Massacre in Boston. I mean, that inspires quite a lot of support or anti-British sentiment.
Right. And Paul Revere. Paul Revere's
Revere. Well, yeah. Paul Revere Prince. Yeah. So that's a bit of statutory information, if you like. But the scuffles they were having were constant. Apparently, they were happening all the time. And this is an accident. Oh, they're abusing the soldiers. They're doing this. They're arguing in the streets. Call out a group, a squad. Really, is all it was. A squad of infantrymen. Called them out from the garrison, armed, bayonets, fixed bayonets, and get them to shoot in the air and clear up this melee. Of course, they fire and somebody gets killed and all the rest of it. Now, the upshot of that is that I don't know how I would interpret it. I'd like to hear a good interpretation of it. Why John Adams, for example, volunteers to defend the British. They're charged in a civil court, a Massachusetts court, and Adams defend. What I see coming out of it, because they're acquitted or they're suspended sentences and so on and so forth, reduced charges and so on and so forth, is what I see at one hand is, and I can't pinpoint it on any one person, and certainly Hutchinson, would not approve, but it shows, I think, or attempts to show the validity of the Massachusetts justice system locally, as opposed to a British sort of approach to that. I mean, don't forget, at the same time, you got the Gaspé incident,
Right, in
which
1772.
I think, going back to Rhode Island is like a cockpit of
Right.
antagonism.
Right, and
Oh,
that's even more significant. That's even more
it
significant.
is.
The way the British, and
Yeah.
tell people what the Gaspé incident was.
Well, Gaspé it's a coastal cutter. It's a customs cutter. It's looking for smuggled goods all through that area, and it runs aground near Pawtucket. It runs aground, okay? And in the night, a bunch of Rhode Islanders, and who's inspired them? Well, they go down and they burn the goddamn thing to the keel, right? The British go nuts. You know what comes to mind is the assassination of Ferdinand. And right away you say,
Sarajevo.
well,
Right,
look,
right,
these Bosnians, I
right,
want them arrested. I
right.
want all of these Bosnians rounded up. So the Crown says, we want all these Rhode Islanders. Well, we don't know who they are. Well, find them. Okay. Well, that is a more significant issue. I agree. It's more significant than the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre is the propaganda of the deed, if you like. I mean, and it stands out. And here's where the literature really comes in. You could be semi-literate and understand what Sam Adams is getting to. The horrid massacre, the horrid. This is unprovoked, an antagonistic approach by an oppressing power on local people. And that, to me, is, with the Gaspé, is a very significant, the two things together say a lot about arousing popular sentiment.
Right. Supposedly Nathaniel Greene was part of that boarding party. Some say that. Now, then in November of that year, in 1772, you have the creation of the committees of correspondence that are created in Boston, and you have about 80 of them that will be established.
The circular letter. The
circular letter. Explain to people what that is.
Right. Well, I think we can interpret that, you and I, sitting here, all these years apart, 200 years of, we can say, oh, well, what they're up to, what they're trying to do is get support for their increasing sense of isolation. Because the Crown really had already decided that Massachusetts is where it's all got to go.
Right.
And so that's a good point to bring up, the corresponding committees, or the circular letter itself in its statements, that here they're doing this to us, they'll do it to you, I mean, which is true of so much. But when you say that, I think you need to back it up. And so it gets quite articulate. I think the committees of correspondence are very important. But I would insist that the committees of correspondence are made up of lawyers, merchants. In New England, they are, for sure. And what I want is to see how that either filters down or is inspired by an appeal to what Sam Adams was doing.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Adams was not appealing to anyone other than the common wharfinger in Boston. That's what he was appealing to. And we're still locked on an urban, and 95% of the American population is living out there. It's getting the message there, I think, that comes out of this corresponding committees. And it's easy to do in New England because you have many corresponding committees. The towns take part in this in their own independent way. In the South, it's more difficult to see because at this time in South Carolina, for example, you've got a form of imperialism, what they call domestic imperialism in political science. I mean, where one little hub controls everything around it, and even the entire, it's like New York used to be for the United States, kind of domestic imperial. Well, I mean, it's what Toronto is to Canada right now, where Rio de Janeiro is and all the rest of it, and Beijing. But that notion that what you had, and this shows up in the revolution, is definitely a class issue. I mean, it's probably more prominent there in South Carolina than anywhere in the colonies, in my opinion. And I make a lot of it in my book on the empire, which, by the way, I spend more time on slavery in that book than I do in my book on slavery. There's quite a lot in there on how it really did. And it's that language that offends so many in Florida and Texas and elsewhere in the United States. It did shape America.
Of course.
How could you not see it? Well, but describing how it did is really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
None of this works. And when we get to the 1840s, the richest people in America are slaveholders. They're plantation holders in the lower South. So the business of class is, I think, a perennial in the South. And I'll use class. Oh, power, the energy saver. Better make sure this is plugged in. Oh, it is. Yeah. What was I? Once you get 5 miles from Charleston, you're in a different culture entirely, and there are no courts, there's no administration of justice. There's absolutely, everybody runs wild, the regulators and the rest of it.
Yeah, by the way, that's the sort of stuff I want to get into in further discussions, the kind of work you did with your slave book, because in this case. I just want to sort of get us to through the coercive acts, which you talked about earlier in the talk, and the reaction of the British. The British, of course, completely go bananas after the Tea Party. And that's when you start to have Gage calculating, and in England, they're calculating, okay, what are we going to do? We're going to have to, as you say, we're going to have to take care militarily of Massachusetts. And Gage asked for 20,000 troops. They're not going to send him 20,000 troops. They reinforce them. But then you have the First Continental Congress formed. So just take us up to that. Take us up to that. Then we're going to ask people, obviously, to chime in. It's very rich, Eric, to hear your discussions about this. Very, very fruitful. Thank you so much for sharing all this with us today.
Oh, thank you. I'm reminded that George III was coached by Lord Bute, and
that's a whole other subject I want to get into further down the line. What goes on with Lord Bute? Lord Bute's his tutor.
He was his tutor.
But that's a whole other story to go.
Yeah, it is something else. Yeah. But anyway, I think to get to the course, that's just sheer. I think Burke puts it very well in his lectures on the Revolution. What happened was that Parliament really didn't understand what it was doing. And I think we have to look at the parliamentarians. We have to look at yeah, it says the energy saver is on, Vicky. I'm sorry, Jim.
Don't worry about it. We've got these modern fangled instruments
to
deal with.
I don't. Should be getting power directly. It says the power saver is on. Anyway, again, British action. You made a point earlier about debt and British debt, and British debt is a constant through all of this. And I don't want to bring this into it, but we need to look closely at Britain in the world, not the American colonies, but in the world. And there is a tendency here, until it gets violent, for the British to think this is a sort of an administrative issue. They have no respect for either the pamphleteers or for the public itself. The 7 Years' War had, in fact, influenced the British way more than it had the Americans. They had no respect. I mean, whether they invented it or not, they got inappropriate support from the colonies and so on and so forth. So there's a sort of hostility towards the colonies in Parliament, and Parliament's paying the bills. And so anything that sort of affects that will redound to what? The budget.
Mm.
And I mean, it's not economic determinism in a sense, but it is, in fact, a sort of an idea that you can handle this. Gage himself is a wonderful example of that. Even though he understood where he was and disdained of his orders, he still thought of it as a police action. Mm. So the British are still treating this. And so we know, and the reaction right away should have told the British that the coercive acts in sequence, but especially the justice part that takes the courts away and the legislature, you can close the port of Boston, they'll get around that. You know, you can quarter act, you have another quartering act, all the rest of it. But the shutting down the government, that goes way beyond anything the Stamp Act imagined, way beyond it. So the British were getting harder in their approach to this dissent. And the term rebellion is the word that's cropping up. Are these people in rebellion, and are they, and can we deal with it, and so on? So I think that the coercive acts may be, I think, from one perspective, the British have spies all over the place. What are they hearing? Well, they're hearing, and we look back at the Tea Party, we look back at the Gaspé, we look back all the way to the Stamp Act. Is this a gradual sort of accelerating process of rebellion? And yes, it is. So they decide then that it's incipient or it's imminent. And so that's the way they handle it. It's a military answer to it, to a problem that's really quite deeper than they understand.
Right.
And so I think, yeah.
All right, let's bring Jillian on. Jillian, go on. You have to unmute, Jillian.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Nellis. An absolutely fascinating talk. Sorry. Sorry, I just took out about 20 feet of poison ivy. I'm trying to survive that.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, not fun. Obviously, in political science, we're interested in many of the same things. You know, what causes people to organize, to revolt. In political science, we have, I mean, I'm not even sure if it's historical, probably an ahistorical theory called fragment theory, where the type of government you have in South America, the US, Canada, Australia, whatever, it's a snapshot at the time of independence. And so that, you know, you tend to have that intellectual debate carried on from the time of independence. Now, in political science, you know, you can do individual surveys. You can do what the historian does, just look at letters. Obviously, you know, we in political science, we're trying to correct for the lies that people tell themselves, even in the letters they write to their loved ones. So we're always skeptical. The base course in political science is on social movements, because of course the biggest thing we can't really explain is when do people organize, under what circumstances they do. And we're obviously interested in that in an international sense. If you look at Assam province in India, you know, they have a problem with immigration and land use. And every time the Indian government defeats the insurrection, it comes up in a different way. And so we've seen 4 generations of a different kind of revolt coming from the same materialist condition. That's not all that, you know, of course, that's not always true. The French peasants had charivari, and for Jim Dingan, we had Professor Camps from the Air Force Command and Staff College, who did a little presentation on the English army and how they were not as bad as people thought they were. I asked him, you know, what the French opposition was, and you know, he concurred that the French military was even better than the British military during the Revolution. And you know, we're you know, for some reason, you know, this went back 100 years, even over Quebec. In Spain, you had the landowners revolt against an attempted tax imposition about 100 years before, I think, the British Civil War. So my point and my question is, I understand as historians, you go very deep and you try to make a causal link between these personalities, their opinions, how they spread these ideas, the social conditions that cause them to be picked up.
Yeah.
The political scientists were interested, of course, in transnational variation. And for us, the American Revolution is, I mean, it basically looks unique. I mean, where else in the world do you have I guess, a European descended population fighting against the metropole when both sides are, have a very high level of productivity relative to the rest of the planet. So this is a point. This is my last point in my question. This is something I bring up all the time. And I don't think Jim is convinced or amused by it, but I'll say it. For me, the American Revolution looks like the British Civil War. I mean, the British Civil War started on the Scottish-English hymn book being combined, which is relatively, I guess, this shouldn't cause a civil war. It was extending a 1% tax to pay for the Navy on inland counties, which is not a big deal. And the king had a parliament. He shut it down. No one complained. 15 years later, holds another election. I think like 20% of the people that got elected in the first one show up to the second one. All the language we see, the extreme escalation, the violence, the pamphleteering looks identical to the American Revolution. Can you comment on the intellectual history? I mean, were the Americans simply playing through this, I guess, a predetermined narrative that had already been practiced by the English people about 150 years or 125 years earlier?
I would say no. That the parallels are there. I mean, you could look at civil wars. There's two civil wars going on in America. There's one internal, loyalists against patriots, backcountry people against tidewater planters, etc. The British enlisting patriot regiments and so on and so forth. I think that if there are parallels, it's in the sort of intellectual teaching to American leadership. They understand British English history better than anyone, better than the English do in many cases, because they're steeped in it. But is the parallel? Is it there? I don't know. It's a difficult one. It is a civil war in that sense, strictly speaking. And again, in political science, you have models to deal with that. And I can't find a model that would fit the historical development of the American Revolution that is like the English Revolution. I mean, the origins of it, I think, are deeper in America. I think the origins are they're sociological in a way that you can't compare. But I think too, it's a useful thing. It's if you put all the revolutions in the world together, how do you compare one with the other? Yes, you have a British population. The older approach to this was that, they are British, but over time, I remember somebody doing a content analysis and saying the number of times the word American shows up increases as you go through the 18th century up to the Revolution. So is there a self-conscious sort of awareness of equality that's being violated? I think it's the other way around. I think, or not necessarily, but what I've come to is that there was disappointment in the colonies over British behavior. Now, that I don't know how you fit that in, Julian. I really don't. But I mean, the point about the parallels is there. It's there in all of the aspects of it. I mean, they are Englishmen fighting against Englishmen, if you want to put it that way. But the point I keep making is that we're talking about a pretty fragmented American culture in terms of its localities and politics. I really do think it's you have to come to terms with that first. And I do think that when intellectually, when James Madison, includes Hobbes in his analysis of political reality. You have what is Hobbes's great notion on the English Civil War. It's the fact that you need a strong government. And to go back to Jim's point, well, that's what Lord Bute taught George III. You've got to be decisive. You can't dick around with these people. You've got authority, hammer them. It's always the way that ideas clash with reality, and models really are very useful for me to start with. But I can't really address that question, but it's a good one. I like it.
Yeah, sorry, Professor Nellis. In fact, political science does not have a model. I was hoping you would eventually come up with one. So thank you very much.
No, I didn't mean a model. No, but it does have starting points that I really do like. And all of us in history I'm writing political history, so I have to know something, about it. I have to find out. And I go to political scientists for that.
Well, thank you.
Right.
Okay.
And one thing I just want to add to that, Julian, is that the issue of the standing army, of course, some of the interpretations we have of the attitudes of people rebelling was that they were angry when these taxes were brought into this equation to essentially supply a standing army of 10,000 troops after 1763. And I've listened to Native American historians, people who specialize in Native American history, talking about, well, the provincials basically wanted to have no restraints. They wanted to be able to militarize themselves to carry out the policies. Look at George Washington with the Ohio Company, which essentially is sort of a land grab scheme into the Ohio's, which is, there's different ways to look at what Washington did.
Well, also,
yeah, go on. What are you going to say?
Regarding the English Civil War, there's nothing you'd have to go to the Newburgh meeting when Washington dismisses the army.
Right.
There's nothing in the American Revolution like the New Model Army. Nothing like it.
Very good point.
That to me is go read Christopher Hill again. The New Model Army and the diggers and the dissenters and all the rest of it. That army, that's a fearsome kind of revolutionary mob. And the fact that it subsides, the fact that it's dismissed, is because Cromwell wanted it to. But nothing like that occurs in America. It may, before it does, and I think that's one of the great things about the American Revolution, and from a sort of global history perspective. And I used to have to teach global history, first year courses in world history and so on. When you compare it to other revolutions and other kinds of revolutions, yes, if you get hung up on it, you're talking about loyalists being persecuted and the savagery of the conflict. And 5,000 Americans died in battle in the American Revolutionary War. Mao Zedong, when he talked about it, said, "This is a picnic." So we can't compare revolutions with any sort. I can't anyway, with any sense. But I do note with some revolutions are different from others in certain specific ways. There's no New Model Army in America.
Right. And very good point. And just to add to what you're saying about the issue of dismissing the army, is that it's going to be interesting to see how we're going to be experiencing some sort of hagiographic look at the United States, which is why I'm doing this, because I really want to get into the reality of what happened. You look at what they did to veterans at the dissolution of the Continental Army. Those guys were just sent off into the hinterlands.
And they went
off with promises of purchasing, of getting land in the Ohio Valley, which they had to sell those land purchases because they couldn't get jobs. Anyway, Michael, go on, Michael. You have to unmute, Mike.
Yeah, just did. I just my question really has to do with the origin and the nature of the differences between Canadians and Americans. Americans tended to be more isolationist and tend more towards extremes, and particularly on the issue of slavery, aside from the economic considerations that in the American South, obviously, at least believe they had more need, if I can use that term, for slaves. But the actual feelings and attitudes about slavery, and in general, the beginnings of those differences and how they developed.
And before you answer that, Eric, just does anybody else have any other comments or questions they want to make? Just raise your hand. Go on. Sorry. Go on, Eric.
Well, slavery in Canada, U.S. I mean, in the broadest sense, and really, I think this is, it's a bit of an exaggeration. But if you take Canada, the Constitution Act of 1791 by the British Parliament, it sort of forbade slavery in Upper and Lower Canada. And yet the loyalists who are flowing in at that time are bringing slaves with them, okay, from New York and so on, into Nova Scotia and into New Brunswick and Ontario and so on. Canadian, that's a tricky question. Canadians tell themselves they're always against slavery. I'm not sure. So how do we see slavery? I mean, this is simplistic, but in understanding American history, I cannot understand it without slavery. I don't see it in any sort of larger perspective than through slavery. And I don't mean the 1607 project. I meant, when Taney says, in the Dred Scott decision, or they're not mentioned in their property, okay, in the Constitution, they're not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. Now, that's upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1757. There's nothing like that in Canada. There's nothing like it. So Canadians, if I take your question to mean what is the difference in approaches to that, I think we tend to be a little more fundamentally critical of it. But slavery is slavery. Yeah.
Right, but essentially there was no institution of slavery in Canada, and I was wondering why the difference was.
Well, it goes back, Mike. It goes back to settlement patterns. Winthrop Jordan put it very well. If you say, what are the causes of slavery in the United States or in America, colonial America? Well, it's imitation, it's availability, it's convenient, it's this and it's that. It's racist. I mean, he describes Englishmen, it doesn't matter what, they're living in Virginia without slaves, but they are fundamentally of the biological notion that that's a different species. I mean, just the language that Winthrop Jordan dredged up of Elizabethan Englishmen talking about Africans, that I don't think it entered French Canada in the 17th century. And the development of an English-speaking Canada is really an American offshoot. And most who come are not slaveholders, or if you go to Nova Scotia. It's a difficult question. It was never started because of settlement patterns. And Canada is a product of Parliament, if you like. It's gone its own way since, but it is a product of Parliament. And by the time America is deep into slavery, it's the high point of slavery, we get the Durham Report, which says, that these are slave-free, and it's after the abolition of slavery in the United Kingdom. So, and in long after the suspension of the slave trade. So there's no possibility of slavery in Canada. Is there a sort of is there segregation? Yes, there is. There's the town of Chatham in Ontario, or Africville in Nova Scotia. Those are segregated Black communities that stem one, the former from the Underground Railroad, and the other from loyalist emigres. So slavery, it's a good point, actually. What we tend to look at slavery, we don't tend to look at slavery. Most Canadians, politicians, journalists, and so on, they see racism in America in Jim Crow terms. That's how I see it, but not through slavery. Do we have Jim Crow here? No, we don't have Jim Crow. We have casual sort of racism, yeah, it's for sure, and we have issues with Native Canadians, Indigenous, First Nations, as we call them here. They're no longer Indians, they're First Nations. These euphemisms and applications are attempts, really, I think, for the Canadian, for Canadian culture to come to terms with certain obvious things. Yeah. Mike, there's no possibility of it. No.
Yeah. So it would just seem that for one reason or another, Canadians are less racist than Americans.
Well,
I've noticed that, but
yeah, I think so. And may I put it another way? Any way you look at it, and I've done a lot on this, my little book, but elsewhere, racism is not institutionalized here, but it's institutionalized in the United States to the extent that the census asks you, which may be the result of the 14th Amendment, but it's institutionalized. It was constitutionally approved. It was constitutionally designed. Slavery and the racism, and it doesn't matter how it comes about. The real good scholars on slavery and racism will tell you that it's stitched in to the system. And I know the conservative approach to that in the United States is to obliterate it, to rewrite it, to get it out of the way. You can't get it out of the way. And Du Bois to James Baldwin make the same point. It's part of the American identity. It really is. It's not in Canada. Toronto has certainly racial problems, mostly West Indian immigrants, Jamaican, and Haitians in Montreal. But there's nothing like what goes on in the United States. And for all the advances, and it beggars explanation, it doesn't seem to be resolved, Mike.
Yeah. And do you think that the difference between the fact that Americans tend to go more to extremes or to extremism than, let's say, the average Canadian, if there's such a thing as an average of anything, but do you think that factors in to that equation?
I think so, yeah. I think there's a bit in that. Here's a society that struggles with the concepts of community. I am an American, and individualism. I am what I am. So there's a conflict there in the American character that allows freedom of thought and freedom to be, in fact, racist. And if you're polite, you don't admit to it, but it's there. It is there. And I frankly find it. I remember as a child, the first Black people I saw, and I mentioned this to Jim, when I'd be about 7 or 8 years old, and we went to watch. They were demobilizing after the Second World War. It'd be 1945, about 45, maybe 46. And the first Black people I ever saw was a sort of company of Black American infantrymen coming out of the railway station in Edinburgh, separated from the whites. And I thought, wow, they're beautiful people. So I don't know whether you learn to be racist or how that comes about, but I thought they were beautiful at the time. Those Black American soldiers, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Alex, come on.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the others that is often historians often bring up with the American Revolution is the connection with trade and the whole, imperial preference system, and whether, Americans just want to essentially be able to trade with whoever they want and not, only trade,
Uh,
with
yeah.
the British. And,
Well,
obviously that continues into the independence period. And of course, you already talked about the Gaspé. I mean, that's targeting, an anti-smuggling. And of course, again, I
yeah.
think I forget, I think it's the Brown family. Yeah, the Brown family, which founded Brown University, were major, they funded basically smuggling. That they had, they bought ships that were bringing stuff in illegally to the colonies.
Well, they were part of the Gaspé incident. Anyway.
Right.
Or what you think about that as a factor in the revolution. Thanks, Eric.
Well, I think, first time I read Charles Beard's book, I was convinced this is an economic sort of a coup by American merchants, whether they're planters or, New Yorkers, or wherever they are, they get together in order to what? Manage trade. I don't think prior to the revolutionary period, there is a strong sense of American merchants, insurance agents, and so on, and tobacco salesmen to trade anywhere in the world. The tobacco trade went to Glasgow and Belfast and so on, and then on to Holland. I think most merchants were happy with that. So, as I said earlier, when you get this series of acts, they hurt merchants first. I mean, the tea issue is a perfect example. You take the middleman out of it, okay, and sell direct to the community. And the middleman is John Hancock. The middleman is the merchant. And I would recommend John Tyler's book, The Merchants in the American. He did this prosopography. He went through all these guys and so on. They were all revolutionaries. So, prima facie, there's a case, for a merchant uprising, wanting to trade with everyone else. And note the difficulties, and I think these people understood that. If you take it up right up to the War of 1812, what's the biggest problem in American history after the Revolution? 30 years later, okay? They're being there's neocolonialism. They're being hampered by the French and the English or the Spanish or the Dutch because they're inadequate, they're impotent. The Americans cannot trade with anywhere as long as those powers say no, you won't do it. So I didn't find anything I didn't look very closely at merchants' records or merchants' notebooks. I was mostly concerned with farmers, but I think, your point's a good one. Did they want? They don't now. Americans don't want to trade with anyone unless it's, in a very narrow sense of it. But then, I don't know, the circumstances are a lot different. And the revolution, I think, caused American merchants more trouble than they got than the benefits they got from it in the shorter term. It was a problem for them. So they, in a way, may have wanted independence, but ironically, they didn't get what they wanted. And that's because of military and diplomatic issues. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. Mark, go on, Mark.
Thank you, Eric. My question has to do with the Canadians. You had mentioned that the British looked upon their colonies on the East Coast as kind of one unit and didn't really appreciate any differences between them. Yet we talk about the 13 colonies not the 15 colonies, including Upper and Lower Canada. So why is it, or what are the variables that explain why the 13 colonies eventually revolted and Upper and Lower Canada did not?
Well, for a start, Upper and Lower Canada are post-revolutionary inventions. You would have the only Canadian, what is now Canadian enterprise before the Revolution is Nova Scotia, 1748. I think your point leads to a really big issue, and that is, I think I counted 26 or 25. Now I'd have to go back to that. 25 colonies, individual colonies in the Western Atlantic, British colonies, and only 13 seceded, right?
Right.
And we've been discussing why they did and all the rest of it. One of the reasons they did is that the people in the 13 colonies, the people who ran them, were resident there. The reason Jamaica didn't join is that it was run by parliamentarians. Jamaica was 80% Black, with a transient sort of administrative unit that was non-governmental. There was no way in which these, from Newfoundland to Trinidad, Tobago, there's no way in which any of those colonies would join the revolution. They were protected by Britain. They were nurtured by it. Everything they had went to Britain with profit. The 13 colonies, on the other hand, each individual, and they're different. South Carolina's politics are different from Connecticut's, but they all shared one thing, and that was making their own laws, especially when it came to taxation. That's a big thing, and that's why I think there's no way in which any Canadian, Quebec would be the example, and of course, the Quebec Act of 1774 guaranteed Quebec French language and the Catholic Church. You want to piss off the rest of colonial America, that's one way to do it. To forbid settlement beyond the Appalachians and then give that territory to the Quebecers.
Well, okay, so is it a matter of the fact that, or is it a matter that the 13 colonies were economically more developed than the other colonies?
Yes.
Okay, so that's kind of what it boils down to.
Internally they were, and I think socially they were. Yeah.
And I also had learned, or I was told that another variable is that Upper and Lower Canada, the governors were ex-Royal Navy guys whose pension came from London, and they weren't exactly going to bite the hand that fed them. Is that also true?
Yeah. That's
okay,
right.
well, that makes sense then. Thank you.
So there's a lot of military sort of administration in Canada, all the way through to really to the end of the 19th century. The governors general were usually sort of military oriented, and there were British troops in Canada beyond 1867, and not long, but after that. There were British garrisons in Canada right up to Confederation.
All right. Well, and want to add, and we'll end it with Roger. Many years ago, an old friend of mine, Marcus Whitaker, was sitting there helping and someone who was presenting a dissertation at Yale. And the dissertation at Yale was basically about how intertwined Connecticut's economy was with sustaining the slave entrepôts of Jamaica and Barbados. And it was really an eye-opener. And so
Whitaker would be good at that.
Yeah. Marcus was very good at that. And this was somebody who was getting, it was basically a defense app. The guy had already got his doctorate. He's giving his presentation. But what I was struck with is when we look at 1763, Jamaica and Barbados are far more valuable to the king and the economy in England than the colonies are. The colonies essentially are in part serving the slavery in the West Indies. But anyway, Roger, you have the last question. Go on,
Can you
Roger.
hear me? Can you hear me?
We got you, Roger. Go on.
Okay. Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting discussion. Your comment about the new model army not being pertinent in the colonies is interesting because, you know, the Continental Army does get trained up in 1778 and becomes far more professional with the 𝗔𝗺𝗶𝗰𝗵 training. And, you know, these are the Continental regiments that will stand toe-to-toe against the British at Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. But, you know, there was a point, though, where the revolution could have become quite, I mean, there were actually several points where it could have become quite radical. You know, you had and again, it was due to Congress not funding the army the way it did.
Yeah.
And, you know, you had the Pennsylvania Line Rebellion, you know, you had, and then you had a very serious situation. I think it was after Yorktown, I think it was up in Newburgh, where Washington's officers basically want to march on Philadelphia. And there's
Newburgh.
And there's that famous meeting where Washington, you know, brings them all in this barn or shed, and he puts his glasses on, you know, and he makes this very heartwarming speech that, you know, I've grown old serving, you know, my country, my you know, and anyway, in any event, you know, you had a Washington to head off potential radicalization of the American Revolution, which I guess you didn't really have in the case of the English Civil War.
Well, I like that. I mean, I think the first question I would say, well, that gathering of the Continental Army in 1782, that gathering, if you could look at the new model army, these guys are deep-rooted Calvinists. They are angry with the royal government, and they are governed locally by Cromwell's almost dictatorial presence. They are a revolutionary group. I think the group is a very good point. That group of officers, they're officers.
There was definite anger amongst them. I mean,
there was anger, but it was mostly for money.
Yes.
What they wanted was they wanted land that had been promised. They wanted this, they wanted that. You know, I mean, Lincoln is a smart man, right? The Homestead Act of 1862, you know, don't run into that problem, you know, with the end of the Civil War. I think the difference is that I think the Newburgh should get more attention, and there should be more attention paid to who it was that was in that group and what their longer term intentions were. I say it was just money and rewards, but I could be wrong. Well,
I do think, though, it was a pivotal, you know, it could have potentially made the revolution radicalized.
Well, I think
if Washington hadn't put a cap on it, I think.
Yeah, I think, and I wonder, that's one of those what ifs, isn't it? It's a good point. Would it have spread if they'd stayed in their arms and possibly spread that message of when are we going to get our pensions, and when are we going to get this, when are we going to get that? That might have gone farther. That's true. I think potential is always there. I mean, one of the problems with the Continental Army was that it was never very large. It was never, you know, it was a problem from the start. But you know, John Adams and others said, okay, let's not make this permanent. So the idea of a permanent military force in American politics is,
What were you going to say?
Anyway,
all right. Well, listen, Eric, thank you so much for your generous time. You really were terrific. All of us enjoyed it tremendously. And
thank you so much. Jan, I enjoyed, I mean, it's just a pleasure to go through this. I mean, don't forget, I'm retired for the 14th time. And so, and up until a few years ago, I met twice a year with my colleagues at the University of Washington and Puget Sound. And there is an organization that I helped start with Richard Johnson called Northwest Early Americanists. Yeah, and it includes British Columbia and so on. And this is the first time I've been able to talk to anyone about all this since then. And those were like nourishment to me, those meetings. We'd have seminars twice a year in Seattle. and I enjoy that. I'm now on Vancouver Island. It's a ferry ride and all the rest of it. And I'm getting old too, you know. And my
Yeah,
wife
we're all
needs-
getting old, but
Ah,
anyway.
you're not, Jim. You look as fresh as ever.
Well,
About
I wish
sleep.
I was a case, but anyway, listen,
Well, I know.
we'd love to have you come
No.
again to talk about another aspect of this. It was a lot of fun to have you. All of us enjoyed this, and I want to thank you
Well-
so much, Eric. It was really sweet of you to spend time with us and talk
Right.
at this great length and so
I
thoughtfully.
say, thank you
Well,
very
so
much,
thoughtful.
and thanks everyone for being so so shrewd to ask the right questions, the questions I could answer.
Right.
Okay. All the best, Jim.
Thank you
All
very
right.
much, Professor Nellis.
All the
Right.
best, everybody.
We
Sure.
look forward to talking to you again.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Well, thank you.